the Sefripa. Today we have a small attendance, but very interesting colleagues. And, thank you for coming. Maybe the attendance of the Sefripa left Kuwait to see Trump in Saudi Arabia. So happy to see you again, and happy to welcome our friend, the friend of the Sefripa, Professor Thorsten Botz-Bornstein. I would say a pillar of the Sefripa since he is here with us every week and for every event. Thank you for being here, always here, Thorsten. So Professor Thorsten was born in Germany, and he completed his studies in France and Oxford also. He obtained his PhD habilitation from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, and he is professor of philosophy at Gust University for Science and Technology in Kuwait since many years. Today he will talk about a book he will publish very soon, and it's dealing with the concept of emptiness. So he will address this concept in three cultural religion and three domains: Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam. Thank you, Thorsten, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I have a microphone. One would think, no, it's not working. It should be red. One would think it's not necessary, but then for the video, I remember last time I had to enhance the sound because it was not loud enough, just because the camera is far away. So maybe it's better with the microphone, I don't have to shout. So this is quite long, and I tried to shorten it. It was difficult because you see, when one talks about three things, then one has to introduce everything, every term, the three notions, and because nobody knows all three, so I didn't make a PowerPoint because it's on my website. You can look it up, so everything was there, the title, and then I made one other PDF. So it's about these three notions, Śūnyatā, Fanā, and Kenosis, that you might have heard of. And I will explain first what they mean. So they all mean emptiness. Emptiness is a notion, important notion in many religions, in philosophy. And there have been some studies on Kenosis, which is the Christian idea of emptying, compared with Śūnyatā. I think there is really no study on Fanā and Kenosis at all, so that would be the first one. Comparing all three is a little bit risky because, of course, they come from different traditions, but still I try to do that. So three times emptiness. I should perhaps first explain why that would be useful. Why would anybody be interested in emptiness? Emptiness is a negative term, but it's important in philosophy, in religion, to empty oneself. One could say that people today, they're all so empty. They have no values, they have no convictions, no religion, no beliefs. They should be filled with something. But that is the wrong way of seeing it. The problem is actually not that they are empty, it's that they are too full. They are full of so many things. And that can be anything. That can also concern religion. I mean, a religious fanatic, his problem is not that he is empty. The problem is rather that he is too full of something. So this problem with filling and emptying is very current in religion. So I compare that. So first of all, there is Śūnyatā. You might all have heard the word. It's Hindu and also it's Buddhist, but it's also Hindu. has been very much developed in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, so in enlightenment, context of enlightenment. Why is it not going up? Because I put the words here so you see what it's about. So there's Nagarjuna talks a lot about that in the context of Mahayana. He's the co-founder of Mahayana Buddhism. It went very much into Japanese philosophy as the emptiness, the ku, which I have here. So that will be the emptiness in Buddhism, and then it is often confounded with nothingness. So one could of course talk for hours about that. It's justifying emptiness and nothingness. Does that mean the same thing? I would say yes. Normally in Buddhism one talks about emptiness, but then Zen Buddhism has had a lot of Taoist influence, and in Taoism nothingness is important, so they talk about nothingness. So the Japanese, you have heard of the mu, maybe in Chinese is wu, like in Wu Wei. So all this is Śūnyatā. So then there is Kenosis. In Christianity, it is the emptying of Christ. It appears in the Bible, the Kenosis. And there I put the passage from the Philippians, and it's almost the only time that it appears in the Bible. So that Jesus emptied himself, and because Jesus is God, it means there's an emptying of God. Because he abased himself to become a human, abased himself to the level of humanity. So kenosis is the self-emptying or the self-renunciation of Christ, giving up his divine nature, though only temporarily, and through this act of self-sacrifice, God's act of self-sacrifice. He introduces first this very exceptional component into the monotheistic system, that God can be incarnated by the person of Jesus Christ. And God gives up his omnipotence, omniscience, becomes a human being, but it happens through emptying. So the Kenan, the word Kenan, appears only 5 times in the New Testament, and it's a little bit like Fanā. There is so much writing about Fanā, but it appears very rarely in the Quran. So I copied this. Is from the Philippians. That is what is a starting point of all that. It is not that central in Christian theology. It was developed in the 19th century. Suddenly there is a real theology of kenosis. Before was not that important. But it was picked up by Buddhists in the 80s, and there was 15 years of discussion where the Japanese philosophers were very fascinated by this idea of kenosis in Christianity. And there are books over books and lots of articles for 15 years, from 1980 to 95 or something like that. I wrote about that. I was working on that before. This exchange, the comparison of kenosis and Śūnyatā, now I wanted to associate this Muslim notion, this Islamic notion of Fanā to it, in order to do something new. So then there is Fanā, and I also put this quotation from the Quran: all things in creation suffer annihilation, there remains the face of the Lord in its majesty and bounty. So Fanin is here rendered as annihilation in this translation. It's from Abdel Hamid, Oxford University Press. And the face of the Lord remains is the Yapkas, which is related to Baka, which I will talk about later. So there is always in Islamic theology this sequence of Fanā and Baka that means emptying and filling, and you can see that this is also interesting for other religions. What we have in the Quran, it's very surprising that Sufis especially attach so much importance to it, because it doesn't seem logical. There is really not much in it, but it has attracted the attention of the Sufis and then also of many Japanese philosophers and Western philosophers from the beginning, because they saw here something Eastern, something from a parallel with Eastern philosophy. Somebody compared it with Nirvana, the Fanā compared it with Nirvana. I don't really agree there. Others talked about Samadhi, is a Buddhist, Hinduist notion, and there is really then a similarity with the Wahdat al-Haq, which is related to Fanā, and one really thinks that there seems to be a parallel with this annihilation of the self, of one's selfish ego. So there is certainly something. I could also mention the Tzimtzum, the Jewish Tzimtzum, which I don't deal with here, but it's interesting. There's a similar idea that God needs to retract himself, because when God created the world, there was no space because he was everywhere. There was God everywhere, so he cannot create anything. So first he has to retract himself temporarily, and then he can create the world. So there is something similar here. It's a Kabbalistic notion, and it's quite recent. It's from the 19th century. It's not something traditional. Of course, you can imagine that it has been very much attacked. So there are some similarities, and I'm not saying that they are that they are necessary. There could be coincidental. There are similarities between what I call dharmic philosophies, that is Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, everywhere where you have the Dharma, and monotheistic philosophies, and it seemed to me that Sufism is a kind of linking element between monotheistic philosophies and dharmic philosophies, and that's what I want to show. I could talk about the historical background, but we don't have enough time, and it's not my field anyway. I'm not a historian of philosophy, but one can of course ask oneself, where does it come from? There are different possibilities. Well, it could be all coincidence, and I believe somehow that it is. It could be that there is a lot of has been communication, and that is also true. There has been in the Middle East, in Central Asia. There have always been contacts between India and the Greeks and the Egyptians already. So of course Islam was impregnated by that, without saying that they would have taken everything from it. Of course they did their own thing. There is a link between Sufism and Neoplatonism. Many people have been working on that. And Aristotle is dominant in Muslim philosophy. So there would be lots of things to say about historical connections. Certainly they existed. There was the Silk Road. They were going back and forth between Baghdad and Central Asia. And certainly they were also transporting certain ideas, certain concepts back and forth. So there are similarities. Why there are similarities, that is a different question. That I will not decide that. I'm just interested. I do comparative philosophy. I'm just comparing. Why? Because I think that by comparing something with something else, one understands better. Understands both better. One sees differences. One thinks about them. And it helps us finally to understand the one through the other. But I'm not saying that they are necessarily that they copy each other. And I'm not into perennialism. You have heard maybe of perennialism. These are people who think that underneath all philosophical traditions there must be one that is so fundamental that we have to find it. Now one is very tempted to do that here. Emptiness, yes, emptiness. Maybe that is at the root of all philosophies, and we have to scrape away all the cultural particularities, and then we will find the philosophy. Now I believe that this is nonsense. It doesn't work like that. It is very likely that a topic like emptiness that came to the mind of many people all over the world in different traditions, and they formulated that in their way, but it doesn't mean that everything comes from one common root. So I have that problem with perennialism, which exists since the 15th century, and many people adhere to it. So I compare, I have to point that I do not compare religion. I do not do comparative religion. I do comparative philosophy, because I think it's impossible to compare religions. I mean, how do you want to do that? How do you want to compare Islam with Christianity? What is Islam? There are so many different Islams, you can't do that. What is Buddhism? It's impossible. I pick certain philosophers and certain concepts that I find interesting, that I find important. I choose them and I compare these ideas. I compare different concepts. Of course, it's sure that all concepts are inscribed in a certain background. But in the end, you compare concepts. You don't compare backgrounds. You compare certain concepts. So I pick certain philosophers, and of course, one can always criticize the choice. One can say that it's random. So I put all you can read that if you're interested. And the book is coming out. By the way, just today is the day where my book, about which I talked last time, is coming out, June 30th, the one on conspiracy theories. So I have here the timeline. You can see the names of people, but you don't know them. Maybe you have heard of them. So it's a Zen master, is a Roshi, and then there's the Murshid. That is something similar, actually. So it's about these masters in religion. Most of them on the Dharmic side are Chinese and Japanese Zen masters. I'm interested in. Of course, there is Nagarjuna that is old, and he's Indian. But then there are other streams, there are other people. There is Yunmen, Wenyan, Yoshu. There's Huineng, probably the founder of Zen Buddhism. So all these people, they lived in the 8th to 9th century, and that, I don't know if it's a coincidence, but it really matches all these Sufis who also lived in the 8th and 9th century. So there is Bastami, Muhasibi, Kharas, Junaid, Halash, Hujbiri, and Al-Shibli. I like Al-Shibli very much. That is called the period of classic Sufism. One can add some other people. There's Kukai, who founded the Shingon sect. He was so that is a little bit 100 years later. He would be the contemporary of Al-Kindi, just to put some parallels to draw a map of the history. And then you have later people like Ghazali, Ibn Arabi, Rumi, Kushairi, that belongs to a later period of classic Sufism, that is 13th, 16th century. In Japan, that would bring us to the Kamakura era, the war period, where many religious teachers came to the fore. There was Dogen in 1200. And then there is the Japanese, the Shinran school, Pure Land school. There's also Ikkyu, that is a bit later, 15th century, but Ikkyu is also eccentric. these eccentric people that somehow matches with the Sufis, with somebody like Al-Shibli, for example. So there on the Christian side there are some mystics. So I decided not to talk too much about Christianity because it was getting just too long, so I took this out a little bit. So then there is the reception. I work with modern philosophers. It's something called the Kyoto School, who have prepared these thoughts somehow. And I said there is this discussion of Śūnyatā and Fanā, Śūnyatā and Kenosis, that has been done by the Kyoto School, but also by other people. And then, of course, there is Izutsu, Toshihiko Izutsu, but he wrote on Taoism, Sufism and Taoism, and he is not from the Kyoto School, but is still very, very similar. So, of course, that is also one of the starting points of all this. So, apart from that, it's Zen schools, Rinzai school. That's what the Scottish school was doing. On the Christian side, there was a very strong response to the Zen Buddhist philosophy, apart from this Śūnyatā Kenosis discussion. There's always been a very strong discussion. There is nothing like something like the Kyoto school, that means a modern school of Sufism, that doesn't exist. So necessarily there it becomes more eclectic. One picks just some people that one thinks they are interesting. So I compare concepts. I don't compare entire religions. Sometimes people say, what you are doing is very broad. No, it's not. It's very narrow. Because that's the only way it can work. I narrow it down to certain ideas. And because you wouldn't say that somebody who compares Swami Vivekananda with John Dewey, that he is comparing Christianity with Hinduism. It doesn't make sense. You compare philosophers, and you are aware that they come from certain backgrounds, but that is all. So the emptiness and fullness, that is an important topic in philosophy, in religion. We have Kenoma and Pleroma in Christianity, and the Sufi tradition works with Fanā and Baka. You empty, and then you have to fill it with something. Now, the Hindu or the Buddhist tradition does not really have that. One could think that they have it. They talk about emptiness, Śūnyatā. There is the word Purnata, but it's not very important because their idea is actually that when you really empty something, you have also emptied it of all distinctions between emptiness and fullness. So at the moment you have emptiness, it no longer makes sense to talk about fullness. Because if your emptiness exists only in contrast with fullness, well, then that means that there is still fullness. You want to get rid of the fullness, so you talk of the emptiness, and this is why I prefer the word nothingness, and Zen Buddhism has always preferred that. It means there's emptiness, but it's so empty that there's not even emptiness. And then you cannot even talk about fullness, so when they talk about Purnata, it is not the fullness, it is actually a fullness that also no longer distinguishes between emptiness and fullness. So in the end, it is the same thing as Śūnyatā. So that thought, which is so important, I thought that I can find something like that in Sufism. The Japanese found it in Kenosis, and of course many people were against it. Many people said, no, you can't do that, no, there is emptiness, and then it will be filled. Exactly like the Fanā Baka, you empty yourself and then you fill yourself with God, and then you have fullness. That is very commonsensical, and most of the time it has been seen like that. But I wanted to tickle out something that is more like this Śūnyatā problem, and I think I found something. So because if Baka, it also is translated as abiding, then it means that one is still sticking to something, and that cannot really be the purpose of Fanā. So the Fanā is this absolute emptying, absolute nothingness that interested me. So we can briefly, we have to mention the notion of Tahit, because this unity, is linked to Fanā. When you enter yourself, you can see you have unity. You have unity with God, and you also believe in Wahid, in God as something Unitarian, is very important, and it's brought about by Fanā. In Judaism, there is the same idea, and it's actually linked to the Tzimtzum. So Buddhism has that too. When there is the no mind, then we can perceive the world as oneness, but we really have to empty ourselves, and then reality appears in a different way as an ultimate reality. So I think it's similar to what they call Hakika or Al-Haq, and I think nobody would contest that. But then again, it has to be determined by emptiness, because the problem is always in all these discourses, if I reify emptiness, then it becomes another fullness. The problem of pantheism is exactly that one sees God as something as a fullness, and it becomes a fetish. What Hinduism, Buddhism says with the Śūnyatā is that there is not only the individual that loses itself, that empties itself, but the thing that comes into the individual must also be empty. So in other words, the divine unity itself must be empty, because if there is still some fullness in it, it is not a unity. It can only be unified when it's completely empty. It leads us to the statement that God needs to be empty. The modern Japanese philosophers, they use the word God all the time for emptiness, for Śūnyatā. They have no problem with that. The nothingness, they will translate it as God sometimes. But then we have God as emptiness. Now that is difficult to push through in Islam. This deconstruction, it has worked quite well in Christianity, because there we have Jesus who empties himself, God who empties himself becomes Jesus. We really have an emptying of God. Now, how could we do that in Islam? This notion of Fanā, it's Bastami who has first worked on it. They didn't invent it, but they worked on it theoretically, elaborated a theory. He's famous saying Subhani, so instead of Subhan Allah, glory to me. Now how can he speak of himself? So there, at that point, there was a schism in Sufism. There are those who are intoxicated and those who are sober. So the sober ones, they didn't like that. That idea. It's a little bit separation of reason and life, real life, that we also have in Buddhism. So that they are torn between reason and life. So a generation later, there was Al-Kharaz. He formulated this idea of Fanā and Baka, and later that was then further developed by his student, by Junaid, who is a little bit better known, and there's a lot of Fanā and Baka by him. Then we have Halash. You might know Halash because of the poetry. People that make music. You can hear that in concerts. So he said Ana al-Haq. So so that was completely intoxicated. He was condemned because of that. And not immediately. He also did some things, some good things. He restored life to the Crown Prince's favorite parrot. So he got some credit for that. Well, he's yeah. So and then there's one of his admirers is Al-Shibli, who is completely eccentric, provocative, and so there is a triangular relationship between these people. But there's always this fight between the intoxicated people and the sober people. So they are all people from the earlier period. It's often called the golden age, the charismatic age of Sufism. So Junaid has this theory of Fanā that is followed by Baka as the subsistence. First, there is the passing away, then there is the subsistence, but then in later Sufis like Ghazali or also Muhyi al-Din or Ibn Arabi, or also Rumi, they formulated in a slightly different way, and that comes a bit closer to Sufism, to Zen Buddhism, I find. So the question is really, can this emptying, the emptying of the self, does it imply that if God can enter the individual, that God has to be also not substantial? There is a fundamental problem. Fanā is presented as the emptying of the human self, of the nafs, when he faces God, and then there is the obliteration of the self, and God, through this mystical experience, God enters the empty space. In Buddhism, similar, when it talks about nirvana, you know, nirvana means blowing out three things, greed, aversion, and ignorance. I think the ignorance is the most difficult thing to blow out. The greed, the aversion, maybe we can manage. Blow out ignorance, well, that's a bigger project. So there's also this idea of blowing out everything and then being dissolved. But there are differences. You see already that the reality that Buddhism then wants to describe is a purely relational, relative reality of impermanence, something non-substantial. So that is already different from the Hakika, which talks more in terms of authenticity and coherence. In Christianity, it's easier. We can obtain a concept of a human God first, and then even of a dying God. But Fanā, does it really address something like emptiness that comes from the side of God? Well, as I said, even Arabi, he uses the term ahad, which is the absolute one. It sounds, well, Isuzu thinks it has an equivalent in the Wahid, in Taoism, so it's not Buddhism, but he talks about Taoism, the one that is used in Taoism, again, as the unity of many. I'm not entirely sure. It seems to me rather that when Taoism and also Islam, they're looking for the one, for the Tawhid, for oneness. To me, it seems that Buddhism is not looking for oneness, but for zeroness. That there is really nothing, so it changes everything. There is somebody, Knish, you might have read him, some people who work on this. He mentioned somebody, Harawi from Herat, is representative of Hanbali Islam. He criticizes the traditional Sufi stations. He says they are tainted by duality, as well as by the mystics' self-centered impulses. So you see that somehow the unity is not attained because there is still a separation of the person from God. And this is exactly what Buddhism wants to avoid. If God is nothingness, then God can really come into the person, and the dualism is overcome. We talk about the individual. What happens to the individual? Is the individual entirely submerged? Does it subsist? Is it completely extinct? Now you see there's a problem if there is no self. In what can God go? In what can God install itself if the self is entirely extinct? One needs another way of thinking here. One needs to overcome this dualism, and some Sufis have tried that. I find Al-Shibli quite funny. He has something Zen Buddhist. You see, Al-Shibli, he wanted to be alone with God, but he wanted to be completely alone with God. That means there should not even be Al-Shibli. He wanted to be completely alone, because if there is Al-Shibli, then he's not alone. Then he's with himself. You see what he is trying to do. He wants to really overcome this dualism through maybe this. It sounds like a joke, because otherwise you reify the emptiness and you just create another fullness that this time you think this must be the real fullness because I have emptied myself and been filled with God. So to avoid that, we should just overcome this logic of filling and emptying, and I think that was his idea. We can say it in another way. It would be a mistake, and the Western thinkers do this. It would be a mistake to think that emptiness is a psychological state. Emptiness is not a feeling. It is just nothing. But we think that there is now the emptiness, and now comes the feeling, and now comes the feeling of emptiness that will be filled with ourself. But it is not, that is also a dualistic separation. It's Cartesian, we have body and mind, so we think the body is a thing, where the mind is separate, it must be another thing. But the mind is not a thing. So Sufism and Zen Buddhism especially, they try to avoid that, to see the spirit as something objective. It's an ineffable spirit, and it's not even a psychological state. So I think they are trying to do things like that in different ways. I will skip something. So this idea, there is the idea by Ghazali of extinction from extinction, that when you are extinct, you have to extinct it once more. That goes clearly in this direction. You see the problem with Al-Hallaj when he says Ana al-Haq, the I subsists there, and so one can say it's because of his intoxication that it does not exist. But what Ghazali wanted to say, it has to be extinct once more. In Islam, one has said that only God has the right to say I. Nobody else can say I. Nobody else has a substance. Only God has a substance. Now, Buddhism doesn't have that problem. When Buddha was born, he said, newborn, he said, I alone am the honored one. He said that already. And that was no problem for Buddhists. That was not seen as egocentric, but they simply found that he had already realized within himself that he has no real self. So his I was already empty, and then he can say that I am whatever because the I was already empty. So you see, it's the same problem in different ways. So I skipped something, but I want to tell a story, a comparison that I found. It takes me, the book takes me a lot of pages to get there, but I will tell you this. You know this story from Taoism. Now this is Taoism, but because Sutsu talks so much about Sufism and Taoism, I think it's justified to bring this up. You know the story of the butterfly. Everybody knows the Zhangzi and the butterfly, and that he thought he's a butterfly. So there is a story that I find very similar by Bastami, where he describes the process of Fanā and the loss of his identity by becoming a bird. So not a butterfly, but a bird. So people interpret it as the loss of identity and restoration of identity, but the question is, after everything that I have said now, should we really see it like that? So he describes this mystical experience, mystical state, where he transforms into a bird. He describes the Fanā, the annihilation, and then the subsequent filling with Baka, which he attributes to the divine, to God's subjectivity, and then also the awareness of God, so the Tahit. And it appears in the Book of Flashes by Al-Sarash, where he Bastami hasn't written it, but where he describes that. Where Bastami is no longer Bastami because Bastami has ceased to be. So Fanā, annihilation, and now he exists only through the inflowing attributes of God, and one can infer from that is kind of immanence and transcendence that produces this spiritual transformation. I can read you this passage. As soon as I arrived at his oneness, I became a bird, whose body was unity and whose wings were of everlastingness. So I continued to fly through the ether of howness, kaifiyah, for 10 years until I came to the air of something like 1,000,000 times. It did not cease flying until I came to the field of pre-eternity, and I saw there the tree of unity. Then I looked and I knew that it was all a cheat, khuda, one translates it as cheat. And that is the last sentence is the important thing. So he was famous for his ecstatic utterances, and it's an account of a mirage. The letter in the Islamic tradition, it's normally associated to the Prophet. So he is flying. In the Jewish tradition too, this flying is kind of metaphoric for ecstasy, for an ecstatic state of mind. People have concluded that this passage alludes to the indescribable, to the attainment of unity, the unlimited, depicting poetically the spiritual journey of unity, reaching unity. But does it really conclusively affirm that he has arrived at a clear identity? Because then he says, and I looked at it, and I knew that it was all a cheat. Now, what is the cheat here? Is it his old identity, or is it his identity as a bird? It could be both. There is no clear answer, and some people have found that. So the dream could also express a state of nothingness or emptiness in which the identity no longer matters. Where he actually arrived is as a state where he no longer cares whether he is a bird or not. So we have this, the same thought we have in the Taoist butterfly story. So you see, it's the flying is always typical for this mystical experience, because flying means, well, it means already taking a risk. It means going into incertitude when you fly, and also you open yourself up to a completely new experience. So the metaphor of flying is important. So we have it in Sufism, and we also have it in Taoism. It's a presumed certainty. Safety is abandoned. So the butterfly parable is in the Zhuangzi, it's the last chapter in this book called The Adjustment of Controversies, and he also deals with the topic of transformation of his dream experience. So it goes in the translation. I will explain why I use this translation. So once Zhuangzi fell into a dream, and then there was a butterfly, a fluttering butterfly, self-content in accord with its intentions, acting happily within himself, and with wishes gladly fulfilled. Normally, usually the famous translation is by Giles, which starts differently. It starts with the sentence, "I dreamt I was a butterfly." Now that sounds much clearer. Here the translator, my friend Hans-Georg Müller, he translated it as once Zhuangzi fell into a dream and then there was a butterfly. You see, there is no I, simply because in Chinese there is no I. He doesn't say I, he doesn't say who is who. He leaves that completely open, and that is important. It's a bit like a dream, like Paul Valéry has said that we should never say that I dreamt, because you didn't dream as I. We should just say there was dream, there was a dream. And somehow you experienced it, but you didn't dream it as an I. It's exactly that idea here, that the I is from the beginning deconstructed. So with relationship to Fanā and Baka, it is something like, it is not that there is emptiness and then there's a fullness, but Fanā and Baka exist a little bit like différence, like Derrida's différence, that the one exists only in comparison with the one and the other in the comparison with the other. So they both constantly determine each other, and that's the only reason why they exist. So the I is not there, and that is the whole purpose. So it also in Zhuangzi, it is not clear whether he is dreaming that he is a butterfly, or whether it is the butterfly that is dreaming that he is Zhuangzi. Because there is no I, so Taoism undermines the identity. And I thought that there is the same thing expressed in this experience of non-identity. Okay, I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thorsten, for this beautiful journey in the three concepts, Śūnyatā, Kenosis, and Fanā. Thank you so much. We learned a lot about these philosophical and religious traditions from many areas and very historical period. Maybe I have a small remark about we focused in the beginning of the presentation, focused on the meaning of emptiness, the Fanā and Baka as emptiness and the fullness. Maybe there is another, it's not a matter of content, of material content, but also there is another dimension which is subsistence or the duration. The term Baka is marked by this meaning. This not only the fullness. It's not a matter of elements or content, but also temporal issue. I don't know if you understand.
No, but I have to choose my words because I compare these.
Yeah.
Śūnyatā is emptiness, so it would be good to have the fullness on the other side. And one talks about filling with God. So that gives us the right to say that Fanā is emptiness. No, it means death, actually. So that's not really the emptiness, but somehow it works because either on the one side they say fullness sometimes, and then the other side they say emptiness. So that way this parallelism could work because that was essential. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been possible to compare this.
Okay. So you choose emptiness and fullness because it's gathering the three concepts.
Thank you, Thorsten, very much. Just as I was listening to you, and especially your mentioning of Taoism, a verse came to my mind from Tao Te Ching, which seems to be directly relevant to this discussion. There is a famous saying where, I will quote, Lao Tzu writes, Therefore, in governing the people, the sage empties their minds but fills their bellies. And I was always kind of interpreting this verse earlier in a Machiavellian sense, that the wise ruler satisfies the basic needs of the masses, fills their bellies, but keeps them in ignorance, empties their minds so that they wouldn't rebel or anything like that. I think now I have to reconsider that interpretation because there might be more to it. It's not about just emptying them from any thoughts, but it might have this metaphysical dimension. I don't know if you encountered this particular verse, but I think
I remember something.
it will fit well
it's
with kind
true.
of bring it in more of Taoism, not only Zhuang Tzu, of course, but Lao Tzu as well. So there's emptiness already in the earlier layers of Taoism. And that's just sort of a suggestion.
No, I think I remember this. There is really something to it, and I mean, with the Zhuangzi, you will read another translation, and you think you read a completely different text, because in classical Chinese you can do many things.
Yeah.
There are no prepositions, there are no conjugations, declinations. You have just words, and then people put them together, and you might have 10 words, and he writes a whole paragraph as a translation, because that's what he thinks what these 10 words mean. And then somebody else writes a completely different translation. So it's not really a translation then. So, and I think this one, I remember something about that. It would be typically Zhuangzi to say, you have to empty their mind, because they are clinging to so many things.
Questions? Yes, Jennifer?
Yeah, so thank you, Thorsten. This was a really interesting talk, and I really enjoyed kind of like the delving into all of these, the meanings of these different concepts. So I'm kind of going back, I'm having an issue with how you define Sufism and how you kind of like basically applying this term Sufism to these ideas. Like what I think what you're actually talking about is tasawwuf. So a number of, like Al-Ghazali, for example, even though the title of Sufism is applied to him, he would not have considered himself a Sufi, right? It's later on that people looking at, he wrote a lot about tasawwuf, and it's later on that people looking at him will consider him to be a saint, right? So a lot of the authors that you're talking about, you're saying that it's Sufism, but really it's writings on tasawwuf. And so I think like there needs to be, and there seems to be, because there's a lot of diversity within Sufism, so like you'd have to talk about the different birds of the Turuk, and then the different Turuk and the different birds within those Turuk in terms of these issues. So I'm having a problem with the application of the word Sufism, whereas I think you're actually meaning tasawwuf, the study of tasawwuf.
But that's the Arab word for
Yes, it's
Sufism,
yes.
so I don't see a difference.
Pardon?
I don't see a difference between tasawwuf and Sufism. That is the Arab word for Sufism.
Well,
You talk about Turuk, maybe another.
yeah, so
Another
you
concept.
have different brotherhoods. So tasawwuf is the study of the soul, right? But within but then you have various Sufi brotherhoods, and so then you have different birds within those brotherhoods, and so they're going to have different concepts. So like and Sufis, they follow a saint. So somebody like Al-Ghazali, he's not following a saint. The people later on are going to claim him to be a saint. So he would in no way would have defined himself as a Sufi, but he does write on tasawwuf, right? And so what I'm questioning is, so you're applying this word Sufism, right? But what the authors that you're actually citing, what they wrote was on tasawwuf, and they would not have considered themselves to be Sufis. They're not following a Sufi saint. They're not a member of a tariqa, right? And they haven't been initiated into a bird, right? So I'm having a problem with your use of.
That happens. I mean, the people don't consider themselves, and later they are considered something, and for Ghazali is a little bit the case. The others, I mean, what I did, I was interested in Sufi, in Fanā and Makkah, and I looked who has been writing on it, and I took them, and these 8th, 9th century people, they are considered Sufis. That's why I say it. What they thought about themselves, I don't really know. I wonder if somebody knows today. This is such a long time ago. There might need to be a specialist to know everything they said about themselves, but they are considered Sufis. Now I see the problem with Ghazali, Rumi. Well, then one says that they are Sufis, and since he happens to talk about Fanā, Baka, I take it. And well, is it wrong to say that he belongs to the later generation of Sufis, even though he himself would have had a problem with that?
Well, this is at a later generation. Like they're very early. Like I said, like other people are going to say that these are Sufis. So when you're talking about later generations of Sufis, like there's new turuqs that are being developed today, right? Like you're having murids that are from the early 20th century. So later, new Sufi thought is being developed. So you cannot say that these 8th and 9th century folks are later Sufis, right? They are
the early ones.
Yeah,
it's called the classical, and then comes the later ones. Well, I just look at who wrote about Fanā. There is Iqbal, who I have a lot on him, and he considers himself kind of Sufi. I mean, he respects Sufis, but then he criticizes them just because he thinks they are losing their self with their Fanā. But still, he is fascinated by Sufism.
So what I'm saying is, be careful with how you're using the word, and how you're using the word Sufi. And really define the term of how you're using it, because from my perspective, I studied Qadariya, I studied most of the Qadariya, right? The way that you're using Sufi is striking me as very strange.
But you have, there is a broad meaning of Sufism with the schools, for example.
Yes, exactly.
Qadiriya, Shadiriya, Naqshbandiya. You are talking about this meaning.
Yeah.
But maybe Thorsten is talking about the philosophy of mind and philosophy of Sufism, in which we find these concepts.
So like what I'm saying is that he needs to be careful with how he's using it.
Yeah, that's why Al-Ghazali, for example, he didn't belong to any school. Or Al-Hallaj, Hallaj also, Rumi. Other question? Yeah. Question?
Yes, sir. Thank you for this lovely journey in the history. And excuse me, just to give a small comment regarding how did you identify the phrase which is in Quran when you call the word fan. It's very important just to liberate the terminology and to clarify the meaning. Fan, it is something everyone shall die one day, and only the God will be remain. So, and you took that word and you just use it in other contexts with the Sufism. Regarding what you were discussing, Sufism has been into 3 categories. The first one is Junayd. It is I think 700. Yeah.
8th century.
Yeah. Junayd, he's the pioneer, and he said, "My way is guided by the book of the God, and everyone likes it." And clarify him as a scientist, a scholar. Now the second phase, Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali, all the Sufis and Al-Kalam people, they consider him the best. In his youth time, when he went to debate with people, whenever he placed himself in a situation, he's the best. If he is like Ash'ari, he's the best. He's Salafi, he's the best. So he was a pioneer in everything. I hear that at the end, he had an issue, psychological issue for 6 to 10 years. Then he came back and he focused on his the life after death. Now the last thing, at the third category of the Sufis, when the Ma'mun in I think 900 after AD, he translated all the books, which is in philosophy books, and imported to the library of his palace. From then, Al-Mu'tazila, Ahlul-Kalam, they started to bring these things. And a lot of people, they embraced that things. The last thing, when we say Sufism say, there is a certain scale. For example, as I'm talking about Muslim, there is a certain scale that is this sentence has been labeled by scholars because Al-Fanā, unity, there is a consensus among all Muslims that whoever says the God, the unity of the God inhabiting in any creature, there is a heart judgment, I won't call it. So the God has to be distinct from his creature. This is in Islam. So I think the book has a lot of things. I'm looking forward to read it. Thank you, sir, for what you give, and I'm writing the best in the book, inshallah. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. There was no question.
I'm just thinking.
Just a remark. There was no question.
No, my question.
No. It's
No, I'm sorry, but you brought all
No
these
problem.
things. Thank you.
Is there questions? I have maybe I would like to add something. You mentioned the comparison between inside the Al-Kindi circle. Al-Kindi is the first Arab philosopher from the 9th century in Baghdad. He worked, in the Bayt al-Hikmah, founded by Al-Ma'mun or by Al-Mansur. And there was a lot of philosophers from the Neo-Platonician tradition, from the Greek tradition, Aristotelian, and very interesting school. And you mentioned that inside the circle there was comparisons, a comparison between Hinduism, Christianity, and Islam, and other religions, maybe Greek traditions. 2 centuries later, or 3 centuries later, in the 11th century, we will have Al-Biruni. I don't know if you know the work of Al-Biruni. Al-Biruni is the first Muslim philosopher, geographer, interested in the mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and he did a journey in India, and he wrote the Book of India, in which he did comparisons between for the first time in the history of ideas, between Sufism and Greek, philosophy, about these concepts of, annihilation, and subsistence, of course, eternity, many concepts, that we could find in many traditions. He did this comparison for the first time. So he is the father of religious studies, or comparative religious studies. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Is he the same guy who measured the diameter of the Earth?
Yes, and very close to our,
99.8%.
Yes.
I didn't
To
know.
our data, from the 20th century. Very interesting. Great, scholar and philosopher. Al-Biruni.
Yeah, I mentioned him.
And the book is translated in French.
Greek. I didn't want to bring too many things.
Yeah, it is translated in French. Acte Sud, le livre de l'Inde. I guess there is also a translation in English. The Book of India. Just was the question. I wanted to add the remark. If there is no question, we could continue the discussion. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Thorsten.